In order to understand the modern gold market, we need to understand the dollar. In order to understand the dollar, we need to understand oil. This presentation discusses the evolution of the petrodollar and the interactions between gold, the dollar, and oil, starting from when Nixon closed the gold window. First, a few details on OPEC. OPEC is the world's most successful cartel operating in the oil market. It currently controls 40% of the world's oil market as measured by sales, and it was founded in 1960 by 5 founding members. These 5 are Saudi Arabia, Iran, Iraq, Kuwait, and Venezuela. The five of these collectively account for about 2/3 of the oil produced by the OPEC nations, and they play very heavily into the timeline that I am about to present. Saudi Arabia by far is the biggest. Their 8.8 million barrels per day of production is more than twice that of any other OPEC nation and about 10% of total world production. Consequently, they have a lot of power. There are 7 other current members who joined OPEC at a later time. Some are in Africa, some in the Middle East, and some in South America. All of them vote, but none of them are as influential as the 5 founders, particularly Saudi Arabia. As I tell this story, I will present a timeline with the price of oil overlaid against the price of gold. You can see that throughout time, the spot price of 2 grams of gold has very closely followed the spot price of a barrel of oil. The two are very closely related. The story of the petrodollar begins in 1971. Before 1971, the dollar was backed by gold, and any foreign nation could exchange their excess dollars for gold upon demand. There were some nations who did just that, with France leading the charge in the late 60s. There was a fear that the gold in the treasury would be completely consumed, and that fear was well founded because between the Vietnam War and Johnson's guns and butter programs, many more dollars were issued than could possibly be redeemed for gold, and so Richard Nixon in August of 1971 announced that the dollar would no longer be redeemable in gold. This removal of gold backing worried many nations, and rightly so. The world had become accustomed to using the dollar for world trade as a result of the Bretton Woods system. Now that the dollar no longer had gold backing, how could its value be maintained? How could this new fiat currency be relied upon to facilitate world commerce? Nixon and his administration had obviously thought about this a great deal before abandoning the peg. In 1973, Henry Kissinger completed a deal with Saudi Arabia that would prove to be pivotal in maintaining the dollar's use in world trade. Saudi Arabia's end of the bargain was to agree to only sell their oil in return for US dollars, and persuade the rest of OPEC to do the same. They were also to attempt to maintain a low oil price. In return, Aramco, an oil company set up to extract Saudi Arabia's oil, was sold to Saudi Arabia and became known as Saudi Aramco. The US also pledged military support to Saudi Arabia to help maintain their security. There were other aspects of the deal that were not disclosed, but it is highly likely, given Saudi's history of demanding gold in payment that the U.S. guaranteed Saudi Arabia, that they would continue to be able to receive gold in return for their oil. As time progressed, the oil market got tighter and tighter. Many in OPEC were already resentful about the U.S. support for Israel during the Yom Kippur War, and they considered raising the price of oil to both punish the U.S. and also to realize more gains in return for their oil. In December of 1973, the Shah of Iran cut back production and raised prices nearly by a factor of 3. The result was a high price of gasoline and long gas lines in the U.S. The punishment was effective. Another funny thing happened though. Because of the increased dollar price of oil, a flood of U.S. dollars flowed to the Mideast. The Mideast governments needed to find a home for all this money. Some of it was used domestically, but since the people in the Mideast were used to a fairly meager living, only so much of it could be spent domestically. Much of it was either used to purchase gold or was deposited into various worldwide financial institutions. This presented a great problem. The banks, in order to make a profit, had to lend this money out. However, if they did, then the sheer amount of loans outstanding could destabilize the entire system. If an oil nation suddenly withdrew its funds from a single institution, then the whole system could crumble. So in 1974, a group of 10 major countries met in Basel to set up an interbank system where banks could lend to each other on pre-negotiated terms. This was the origin of the LIBOR interbanking lending rate. When a bank needed money, it could borrow from another. So long as the petrodollars remained in the system as a whole would be safe. In addition, the IMF set up a special oil facility for recycling petrodollars. They arranged special loans to economically distressed countries and also arranged special loans for other purposes. The next few years were very inflationary. The U.S. had to keep printing fresh dollars to keep up with the oil trade and the increase in oil prices. The extra dollars circulating drove up the price of other goods and services. OPEC gradually raised prices in response to the extra dollars and their reduced purchasing power. You can see how the U.S. responded to increased prices by OPEC. In 1978, Fed Chief Arthur Burns proposed selling Treasury gold on a regular basis to defend the dollar. And who do you suppose the message was intended to influence? Well, the Saudis, of course, because of their influence on the value of the dollar and their interest in gold. Later that year, Treasury Secretary Blumenthal met with a group of Arab leaders with a pledge that the U.S. would defend the dollar vigorously in return for a promise to maintain oil prices at least for the remainder of the year. And how would the dollar be defended? Through the handling of the price and availability of gold, of course. And this foreshadows future events where Treasury Secretaries and Federal Reserve Chairmen have stated that they would defend the dollar vigorously. But negotiations between countries can only be honored so long as there is political will to support those promises, and so long as the leadership of those nations stay in power. Prior understandings were thrown out the window when the Ayatollah Khomeini rose to power in Iran during a military coup. The Ayatollah cut off oil supply. As a result, the oil markets again became extremely tight. Many oil-producing nations discovered that they could get a better price for their oil on the Rotterdam market, which at the time was a spot market, than in privately negotiated supply deals. As a result, in this mode of price discovery, oil prices shot up very quickly, as did gold prices, as oil profits chased any available gold that was available for purchase. This was the event that almost spelled doom for the petrodollar. And then, as if influenced by the divine hand of God himself, things turned around. Then Fed Chairman Paul Volcker raised interest rates to the mid-teens, making reinvestment of petrodollars into Treasury instruments attractive. For a time, new petrodollar supplies were mopped up. A new gold derivative market was created, and paper gold started trading freely. And, at that time, Iraq also invaded Iran. It should be noted that Iraq had plenty of support from the U.S. in the form of money and weapons. It also had the support of Kuwait in the form of loans. The Iraq-Iran war went on for several years. It left Iran defeated. Their oil supply was reestablished. Unfortunately, it left Iraq in a poor position. They were deeply in debt to countries such as Kuwait, and were having trouble making payments. So in June 1990, Saddam Hussein petitioned OPEC to raise oil prices so that Iraq could increase revenues. OPEC was unsympathetic, and so in August of 1990, Iraq invaded Kuwait, citing as their reason Kuwait's practice of slant drilling, which was alleged to tap into Iraq's reserves. The U.S. was not pleased with Iraq's invasion and annexation of Kuwait, and so began Operation Desert Storm, the beginning of the First Gulf War. It did not take long to force Iraq to leave Kuwait. The U.S. did not pursue Saddam's armies. Obviously, this left Iraq in a very bad position. They still had major debts to pay, and were just defeated and humiliated before the world. In short, Saddam had a grudge, and was looking for an opportunity to save face. Flashback about 3 decades. The Europeans were all very concerned about the United States' exorbitant privilege created by the monopoly the dollar had over world trade from the Bretton Woods system. The U.S. was the only nation that could deficit spend with impunity. The concerns grew with the closing of the gold window, and so a group of Europeans worked diligently behind the scenes on a new currency that could be used for world trade. But because establishing a currency big enough to compete with the dollar would require all European nations to cooperate, it would take time to establish political support. Finally, in October 1999, the euro was introduced to the world as a parallel currency to the dollar. Okay, back to the petrodollar story. In October of 2000, Saddam Hussein announced to the world that he would now accept only euros in exchange for Iraqi oil, as part of the Oil for Food program established at the end of the Gulf War. This probably didn't sit well with U.S. leaders. Over the next couple of years, it was alleged that Iraq had developed weapons of mass destruction. Because the U.S. was still very sensitive from the terrorist attack on 9/11/2001, the invasion of Iraq had enough political support to proceed in March of 2003. Shortly after the invasion of Iraq, the invasion, Iraqi oil was again priced in US dollars. In December of 2006, Hussein was killed. But Iraq was not the only founding OPEC member that challenged the petrodollar after the introduction of the euro. Iran also openly challenged the dollar in 2007 by requesting that oil customers pay in currency other than US dollars. The US responded by introducing unilateral sanctions against Iran with an effort to get other countries to participate. The oil price at the time started to increase extremely rapidly. Two events resulted in a reversal of this trend. The first was an announcement that Iran's banks would all be frozen out of the SWIFT system for international trade settlement. This essentially froze Iran's ability to trade. Additionally, in September of 2008, H.R. 6899 was signed into law. This bill, under the guise of an energy independence bill, resulted in the selling of a tremendous amount of oil from the Strategic Oil Reserve. The argument went like this: U.S. refineries are geared up to process heavy sour crude, and so we would be unprepared to economically refine the light sweet crude held in reserve. And so the bill called for replacing a large percentage of light sweet crude in the reserves for heavy sour crude. 20 million barrels were to be offered for sale within 60 days of passage, with 70 million barrels to be sold within 6 months. This spooked the markets because of the huge volumes of oil involved and helped relieve the pricing pressure on oil. Libya, though not a founding member of OPEC, also has challenged the petrodollar. May of 2001 marked the formation of the African Union. The hopes was to create a trading bloc similar to the European Union. In 2009, Libya's Muammar Gaddafi was elected chairman of the African Union, and he immediately proposed that the African Union create a gold dinar to be used in trade. This would have been an innocent and non-threatening move had he not proposed that the dinar be required for oil purchases from any African nation. But he did propose it. Civil war broke out in Libya shortly thereafter, and in October 2011, Gaddafi was killed. Venezuela has been another OPEC member who has openly challenged the petrodollar. In October of 2005, Hugo Chavez proposed the formation of a central bank for South America, which would use euros as a reserve asset and facilitate the trade of South American oil for euros instead of the dollar. In August of 2011, Chavez declared another vote of no confidence in the dollar by calling in the nation's gold, which was accomplished shortly afterward. Coincidentally, Chavez died of a massive heart attack in March of 2013. It seems fate is not very kind to those who want a dollar alternative. This pretty much brings the timeline of the petrodollar to the present. So let's put a few things together. We know that special agreements were made between the US and Saudi Arabia in the early 70s to maintain the use of the dollar in world trade. The US sold Aramco, promised military support, and made other promises, although the nature of those promises were undisclosed. We know that special structures were created to deal with the flood of US dollars that would result from this trade for oil. These institutions were primarily responsible for recycling petrodollars. Special loans were made to the advantage of the Saudis and other OPEC nations. The U.S. promised to vigorously defend the dollar, and has done so repeatedly over the past 40 years. That form of defense was in making sure that the dollar was strong in gold, enabling gold to flow where it needed to go, which was to the OPEC nations. The euro had been in the works for many decades in response to the exorbitant privilege Americans enjoyed in world trade. The alternative currency was introduced in 1999. This marked the start of the gradual waning of political support for the petrodollar. 4 OPEC members so far have openly challenged the petrodollar. Saudi Arabia so far has been conspicuously uninvolved. One has to wonder why the Saudis have been quiet, but it probably has to do with the arrangement that was struck in the 1970s that has continued to this very day. Most importantly, the dollar is still loosely backed by gold, but only because the dollar is backed by oil. This will persist so long as the gold price can be managed and the flow of gold guaranteed. We can conclude how well this is working by observing the rising price of oil, the rising price of gold, and the open challenges of the dollar's supremacy.